Okay, as I mentioned, I'm going to take a minute to go through the practice guide for from the What Works Clearinghouse on adolescent practices in a Tier 1 classroom. I want you to know that if your students are struggling beyond um, in word recognition, then we really need to stop and find additional supports for them, because you're not going to be able to support a student who's struggling at the foundational level of literacy in a Tier 1 classroom effectively. But you will be able to work with the teachers and help them to access your curriculum, even if they are having those challenges. So we're going to specifically look at what can a classroom teacher do? What can I do in my history classroom, in my math classroom, in my English classroom? So one of the things, I'm going to go back through, okay, we know that in order for our students to be ready, and we're going to really be focusing in on these things on the last two pillars, the vocabulary and the comprehension. But we know that for our students to be ready for the kind of reading that we want to do on the secondary level with them, they have to have these foundational skills, right? They have to have these foundational skills. And you might find that your students are lacking them. We can work on the fluency, the vocabulary, and the comprehension in ways that support all of our students in the classroom and are just going to help us to create an effective Tier 1 classroom. If students on the secondary level are dealing with issues in the word recognition side of things, this phonemic awareness and this phonics, that is when you're going to really need to be accessing additional supports for them. And hopefully those students are getting that support, because you're not going to be teaching phonemic awareness and you're not going to be teaching phonics in the Tier 1 classroom. So hopefully you'll be able to get some supports for them. But remember, the reason that we want to be thinking about this is because we know these are two things from past lectures. We know that word recognition and language comprehension equals reading comprehension. So we know that our students need to be able to decode and recognize the word. Makes sense, right? We also know that our students need to have these language skills. They need the background knowledge and the vocabulary. They need to know how to draw inferences and have some verbal reasoning. But those two combined create reading comprehension. That's also where we know that if they're lacking, if they have a 0 in either one, because this is a multiplication problem, 0 times anything is 0. A student simply cannot read without language comprehension, and they simply cannot read without word recognition. Now, they could have issues in those. They could be weak in those and still be able to read. And that's where we're going to come in as the Tier 1 teachers. The other thing I have up here, this was the simple view of Scarborough's reading rope, where it talks about the different components of word recognition and language comprehension. And these are things like literacy knowledge, verbal reasoning, language structures, vocabulary, and background knowledge. And those things are what kind of weave together along with those first two pillars, right? Along with those pillars, those are the things that kind of increasingly become automatic and fluent. So we're using the IS practice guide for effective classroom and intervention practices for secondary classrooms. And last week, I talked a little bit about the explicit vocabulary instruction. This week, I want to take a minute and look at direct and explicit comprehension strategies, okay? And so we'll do these other 3 components later on in the course. But when we talk about comprehension strategies, I want you to think about what we mean by the word comprehension strategies. There's a lot of debate and a lot of overflow between when something's called a strategy or a comprehension strategy or a comprehension skill. But I want you to think about it in this. Skills is the abilities that students use to answer questions about a text after they read it. So those are the things that they do to demonstrate comprehension, right? Strategies are the things that they'll employ during the reading, so that when they get to the end of the reading, they're able to employ the skills to complete the reading tasks. So we have some specific evidence of what are the strategies that we want to focus in on in the classroom. And what I'm going to do for most of the rest of this video is show you some of the ways or some of the tools, a strategy or a teaching instructional strategy for each one of these comprehension strategies. But these are the things that research tells us are high impact. If teachers teach these and students employ these, they are going to have better comprehension. So what are the high evidence comprehension strategies that we want to focus in on? We want to summarize main ideas within and across texts. We want our students asking questions as they read. We want them being able to paraphrase what they've just read. We want them to draw inferences based on information and prior knowledge. And we want them answering questions as they read and using graphic organizers. Why? Because that allows them to self-monitor and identify when they didn't understand something. Have you ever been reading something and you're like, oh, I didn't get that. Let me go back and reread that. Oh, my mind was wandering. Let me go back and reread that, right? So what do we know about the teaching of comprehension strategies? We know that we want them to be direct. We're actually going to teach the students exactly what that looks like. What is an inference? What will it look like? How did I do it? And we're going to be explicit, right? Today you are going to learn how to draw an inference using evidence from your textbook. Like we're going to tell them, we're going to give them the language of comprehension, and we're going to give them guided practice. We're going to use a guided release of responsibility model, which is where I do it. Then we do it as a class. Then I have the students do it alone, do it together. These two, the you do together. Those sometimes will kind of go back and forth. Sometimes you'll want to put them in groups and then get them to do it individually. Sometimes you want them to do it individually and then get them in groups. But it's this idea of releasing the responsibility for me as the teacher. I am going to show you explicitly and directly how to do this, but then I'm going to have you do it on your own. Okay. So one of the things we want to think about when we are engaging in direct strategy, comprehension strategy instruction is what text we're going to use and for what purpose, right? So while strategies really can be done across specific texts or all texts, really, and you should be able to do those employ those strategies across text, some texts will lend themselves better to some strategies than others. So the example I put in here, I wanted to show you, when I want to talk about what an inference is, when I taught ELA, when I taught 9th grade ELA, when I wanted to talk about inference, I found this really lovely story by Alice Walker called The Flowers. And in this story, I mean, seriously, you could probably read this whole thing. It is a 2-page story, which is another reason why I like it. But it's a story about this girl. We need to figure out through context clues that we're talking about the Jim Crow South. Through context clues, we can figure out that she's a little black girl that goes out on a walk in the middle of the day. Through context skills, we find out that she stumbles upon the victim of a lynching in the woods during her walk. Nothing is directly told to the reader. And the whole story, it's a really good story to teach this idea of loss of innocence, but nothing is directly told to the reader. The reader has to look at clues. Okay, what are the clues that this is that this girl is a black girl? She clutched her dark brown hands, right? What are the clues that this girl is that her parents are sharecroppers, right? So we look through and we find this evidence together as we read it. And so that's why I use this book this story, because it's a really good text for teaching inference. It wouldn't be such a great text for teaching other aspects, right, of literacy instruction. Okay, so that's something to think about, matching your literacy instruction with your texts. I know that that you might not understand, right, how to determine that. But one of the things to think about is text complexity, and all of our texts are going to be complex for different reasons. And so one of the things that we want to think about is certainly the quantitative measures. And that's what you'll often hear. Oh, that's at a high Lexile range. That's, that is in a 1500 Lexile range, which means that it's a college, it's a 11th grade, appropriate book text for an 11th grade. Well, that's one thing, but let me tell you, that story, The Flowers, that I gave you, it probably comes out about a 4th grade reading level, but qualitatively, because of the content, because of the things that are left for the reader to infer, it's actually a much more complex text. So I would look at it from a qualitative measures. And then the last thing I want to think about is the reader and task, because I'm asking my students to do something as complex as inferring, drawing an inference from something. That's a complex text. So therefore, these things taken together, even though my quantitative measure may be low, that's how I determine, hey, this is a decent text to use with my 9th graders. And so I want you to think about that, especially if you're teaching in a physics class, right? You might have a really complex scientific theory. So it's okay to bring in a popular science magazine to get them to understand, because it's still rigorous, because the content, the ideas are pretty complex. And then what we ask them to do with it is going to also usually be where we're going to really introduce rigor. So even simple texts can be rigorous. And that's why I wanted to talk to you just real quickly about this idea of text complexity. Because when we're teaching comprehension strategies, we want to have the appropriate level of complexity. It's kind of like Goldilocks, right? You might not want it to be too complex, but you want to figure out how accessible does it need to be. But you also want to make sure that it's complex enough that they have to employ these comprehension strategies. All right, so let's look at, I'm going to talk about like some ways that you could be explicit and direct with each of the strategies. So one of the strategies that they talk about teaching is summarizing the main idea within and across text. Well, one of the things you'll find out quickly about summarizing is that it is also a writing exercise usually, right? So our students generally, when they have difficulty with a summary activity, it's really becomes hard for us as the teacher to decide, is this a writing problem? Is it an encoding problem? Or is it a decoding problem? Are they having problems comprehending the text? And so one thing you might do is find something like these templates. This is from Gerald Graff and Kathy Berkenstein. They're called, this is a book called They Say, I Say, Academic Moves That Matter. And they actually give students some nice templates, right? Introducing something implied or assumed. Although X does not say so directly, she or he apparently assumes blank. Introducing standard views. Americans today tend to believe that. I love this one. This is a whole paragraph like on how to introduce an ongoing debate. So one of the things you might think about is actually giving your students sentence stems, or even a sentence frame, and having them fill it out with key details from the reading, so that they're summarizing the main ideas within or across text, but you are able to make sure that they're getting the main idea and that it's not writing that's causing them difficulty in that task, right? So another, I'll move this a little bit, okay? Another task that we're strategy that we're told to read is to ask questions as you read. Well, one thing you might do with that is actually share with the students sentence question stems. And one of my favorite tasks that I used to have them do is actually create reading quizzes. And I tell them, what levels I wanted them to write their questions to, or maybe I would ask them to do more knowledge and comprehension questions, but then come up with one application and one synthesis question or whatever. But I would give them sentence stems. When I taught AP, I gave them the stem of all of the AP language, the most common sentence question stems, and AP language on the AP language test. And I actually would give them a passage, we'd read it together, and then I would have them work in partners, right? And they would use the question stems to ask questions about the text. Because believe it or not, our students maybe don't know how to ask questions of the text. So being explicit and direct in this skill will help them, so that hopefully then they start to ask the questions more naturally and organically, right? So another strategy, teaching your students to paraphrase as they read. This is a great strategy. This is probably many of you have already encountered this, the Cornell notes taking strategy, right? Where the students use this to kind of do some keywords as they go. and they use the notes column to paraphrase the important information that they got. And then most importantly, in the bottom there, they summarize it, right? You can see how all of these are so interrelated, right? So terribly, how do you paraphrase without summarizing, right? So this is a great tool, and there's a lot of good graphic organizers for you to give your students so that you're tasking them with paraphrasing as they read. Oh, I don't know what that was. All right. Let's see here. What was that? I gotta fix that one there. The next thing that you might think about doing is asking them to draw inferences based on information or prior knowledge, right? So drawing inferences is really hard. So what you talk about is how you have to guess, right? You have to make an informed guess. You have to use evidence. So one of the ways that I like to practice that is by using visuals. So this was a great exercise that I found. The New York Times has amazing education material out there. But what it does is this particular resource, it takes out the caption, right? And it asks the students to look at these compelling pictures and decide what's going on. What do you think is happening here? And so what you would do in this exercise is you would actually have them make their guesses, but then they have to prove that, or they have to explain that using visual evidence from the picture. And then the last thing that you want our students to do is answering questions as they read, or creating a graphic organizer. This allows them to self-monitor, to identify when their comprehension is starting to break down. And it forces them to stop and kind of do some fix-up strategies, right? Oh gosh, I don't think I understood that. And so here, one of my favorite ways to teach this is the stop and jot. I will give my students a reading assignment, and I will give them Post-it notes. And you might give them an anchor chart like this one. And they actually, you have to sometimes go down to, like, I need at least 5 stop and jots in this reading, right? But you don't tell them what they have to answer, but you give them these question stems, and then they have to go in and they have to stop and jot ideas. And they can often, they can draw their responses, they can write their responses, or they can do some variation on that. So those are just some quick examples, and from your book Subject Matters, you got more. Those are some of the examples of how you can explicitly teach comprehension strategies, with the importance of understanding that comprehension strategies are an effective intervention that we can do in our tier 1 classroom, and that we want to think about how we can teach those comprehension strategies within our own disciplines. And we want to think about the relationship between the comprehension strategies and the text that maybe we're asking our students to use. Okay. All right. Thank you. And next week we'll go over the next intervention strategies. Thanks.